We all have these little things we want to do better in our lives, whether that's wake up at 6 a.m. so that we go jogging because that was on our New Year's resolution list, or call up our grandmother on her birthday, right? It's all these little things. Maybe you just want to eat one healthy meal a day. So these are these key points where we need to make better decisions. And when we don't, which we often don't, why so many New Year's resolutions fail, we start blaming ourselves, and then we develop stress, and then we wind up making worse decisions maybe than if we hadn't tried to fix anything in the first place. And so what we talk about in the book is, the fact that we continue to make poor choices despite wanting to behave differently tells us that we're missing a part of the puzzle. And if you ask where do decisions come from, it's quite clear that they come from the way our brains are wired.
I'm Casey Main, a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl searching for meaning. And my mission is simple: to make life better, for myself and for you. I believe real change always comes from within, and the Better You podcast was born to discover hidden parts of ourselves and our stories. A safe place where we have real, honest conversations with people from all walks of life to help better understand ourselves so we can become better versions of ourselves. So come along on this journey of discovery with me so you can become a better you. And welcome back to another episode of the Better You podcast, where we focus on better understanding our relationship with ourselves. I'm your host, Casey Main. Thank you so much for being here. I absolutely love this episode and this conversation. So I have in my hands this book titled Brainwash: Detox Your Mind for Clearer Thinking, Deeper Relationships, and Lasting Happiness. And it's written by the father-son duo, both doctors, Dr. David Perlmutter and Dr. Austin Perlmutter. And this book is so great. It gets all into how our brains work, kind of how our brains evolved, and then the real neuroscience and anatomy that goes into making better decisions. So any little changes you want to make in your life. So all the kind of New Year's resolutions we all come up with, or even on a weekly basis, okay, starting Monday, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And then a lot of times we don't do it. We think it's just a lack of willpower, but this book really explains how that's not the case, how life in the world today is set up to almost work against our brains, which is then impacting our ability to make better decisions. And then it gives all kinds of very realistic, practical tips to reverse that process so that you can get a little bit more control over your decision making. And it is the most informative book I have read in a long time. I highly recommend it, and I am so excited that I got a chance to talk to Dr. Austin Perlmutter about it. This is just a great conversation. I wish it could have gone on longer. My hope is to hopefully have him back on the show again, because he's just a wealth of knowledge in all things I'm super interested in and would make for great topics for the podcast. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you all that for the next couple weeks, I will continue to air 2 episodes per week on Tuesdays and on Thursdays. Then starting in May, I'll return to 1 episode per week every Tuesday. So the second episode this week is actually a very spiritual one. We are talking to Reverend Peter Panagore, who has had not 1, but 2 near-death experiences. And him and I have a very deep conversation about what he experienced when he was on the other side and how it differs from some of the main teachings in mainstream religion today. So just a heads up that this conversation might be a little bit controversial for some people, which I completely understand. If you are very religious and don't enjoy conversations that question certain aspects of beliefs, then you might want to skip this episode. Absolutely no hard feelings. My intention is not to offend or upset anyone. It is simply to get us all thinking new thoughts and opening our mind. And I love these types of conversations where we really analyze different ways of looking at things and interpreting teachings that a lot of us grew up with or maybe still have in our lives today, depending on where you stand in your religious beliefs. So that episode will air on Thursday. And then next week, we talk to Talia Pollock, who has a new recipe book coming out titled Party in My Plants, which I think is just hysterical. And her and I have just a really fun conversation about plant-based diets. And actually, eating a more plant-based diet is one of the things talked about in the Brainwash book. So that's a good follow-up episode to the conversation today with Austin Perlmutter. All right, so let's hear a little bit more about him. Austin Perlmutter is a board-certified internal medicine physician and New York Times bestselling author. He received his medical degree from the University of Miami and completed his internal medicine residency at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. His focus is in helping others to improve decision-making and quality of life. He is also interested in methods of understanding and reducing burnout in the medical field. He is the co-author of Brainwash, and he writes for Psychology Today on his blog, The Modern Brain. And in this episode, we discuss how making good decisions is more complicated than willpower, how different lifestyle factors like sleep, stress, and inflammation affect our ability to make good decisions, disconnection syndrome and how the wiring and connection patterns in our brains affect our decision-making, how the modern world is wiring our brain for poor choices and what we can do about it, a healthy strategy to use for digital media consumption, the pros and cons of our sense of community and why we care about what other people think, how to reframe moments where peer pressure is tempting you to make a bad decision, how we can make structural changes in the brain that will aid in better decision-making, the brain benefits of spending time in nature, and how practicing empathy can rewire our brains for good choices. As always, if you enjoy this episode, I hope you will take a moment to give it a rating or even write a short review. That really helps so much, and it means the world to me. I love seeing new reviews, and I love hearing what you guys think of the podcast. And then it also helps with all the podcasting algorithms and discoverability and just all that craziness. So if you enjoy this episode, or if you've been listening to the podcast and enjoy it, please take a moment and give it a rating and review. Okay, so that's it. We are going to go ahead and jump into this conversation with Dr. Perlmutter. I hope you guys enjoy. All right, so I want to start with, I guess let's start with just a little bit of your background so the audience can get to know you. So tell us a little bit just about kind of who you are and what you've been up to.
Well, the who you are question is a hard one to answer. The more that I dive into philosophy and spirituality, the more I realize that's a tough one to give in a few lines. But I guess the more objective stuff is that I went to University of Florida, as we were just discussing, for undergraduate, and I majored in English with the initial plan that I was going to become a young adult fiction writer. And I met with several professors, and they just told me English is not the place you want to be going right now. And instead, you should look at perhaps some other career options. And I had kind of decided I was going to do the pre-med track because I was interested in science, and I always thought there's a possibility I would go into medicine. So I wound up, not with some sort of really deep desire initially, but with building intent, going into medical school. And I found that what that did for me is it allowed me to unify a couple of somewhat disparate likes in my life, which included I like talking to people, I like helping people when possible, I like science, and I like having intellectual conversations with other people who are willing to question and to be a little bit open-minded about why things are the way they are. And so those all came together for me to an extent in medical school. And I decided that within medicine, we kind of have this opportunity to specialize. Some people go off and become neurologists, like my dad. Some people go off and become surgeons. Some people become psychiatrists. I instead picked general medicine, which is internal medicine in this case. And the reason for that is I found that there was a significant gap between what people were doing as far as their health and what they could be doing as far as their health. Meaning that when you look at the most costly, deadly, and morbidity causing, so disability causing diseases on Earth right now, these are chronic diseases, things like heart failure, like diabetes. And these, to a large extent, can be prevented by the choices that we make. So I saw there's this major opportunity, which is that there's something going wrong. We have the information, and yet people aren't necessarily following through on it. They're still developing these diseases that we know how to prevent. So I went to an internal medicine residency in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, to learn how to manage chronic diseases because I wanted to know, what do we actually understand about these conditions and what do we not know yet? And I wound up becoming a bit disheartened in my training because I found that while the quality of my training was excellent and the program was fantastic, the interventions that we were making to help people get healthier had more to do with helping slow the rate of progression to disease. So for the most part, I would see people who already had problems, and I was just trying to kind of slow down that curve so they weren't falling off so quickly into really severe diseases. Or even the people who already had severe diseases, we're just doing everything we could to patch them up in the hospital and sending them back out for another few weeks or a few months before they come back in again. And so what was disheartening about this is I felt like all of our efforts were putting band-aids on these bigger problems. And I know a lot of people actually say that as it relates to medicine, which is we're not getting to the cause of the problems. And I thought, that's interesting. I like the idea of using nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle modification to help people so they don't get sick. But there was this other piece of it that was still even more interesting to me. And that actually is the topic of this book, Brainwashed, that I wrote with my dad. And it has to do with how we're making decisions in the first place. So it's not just about knowing we have to eat healthier food. You and I both know that donuts aren't good for us. Everyone listening to this is going to know that donuts aren't good for them. That's kind of taken as a given. And yet we still eat donuts. So we kind of think as doctors, we just tell people, here's what you need to do to be healthy. And once they have the information, they're going to do it. And if they don't do it, it's a willpower problem. So then I can blame them and write in my chart that I did what I was supposed to do, but they were just non-compliant. And so even with all of that helpful nutrition and exercise and lifestyle modification, it wasn't enough. It's the decision-making itself that is the interesting piece. And to that end, what we talk about in the book is our decisions are determined by the wiring and connection patterns in our brains. So if we want to understand why we do the things we do, we need to understand how our brains are wired. And that kind of brings us to the overall topics of the book, which are that the modern world is wiring our brains for poor choices, but we have the opportunity, we have the tools available to reverse that damage and to instead wire our brains for good choices.
Okay. I love that on so many levels. And I hear you on the getting disheartened within the healthcare system. So prior to this life, I had a whole corporate career in healthcare and sales and marketing and all that stuff. And I did a stint in corporate health, which was all about exactly what you're talking about. Like the majority of the diseases these days can be prevented with lifestyle changes. But to your point, that's then kind of, I guess, the healthcare system saying like, okay, people, it's in your court, like the ball's in your court. We've told you what to do. Now go do it. And what I love with this book is you're kind of then bringing it through science, tying it back in with healthcare to be like, okay, but what is the real reason behind why we aren't making these better decisions? Because you're right. We all know what we should be doing. And the only real question that matters now is like, why are we not doing that? And that's really like what the book addresses.
Yeah, that's it. And again, the standard, the status quo is that if you go to your doctor's office and let's say, average American overweight. So you're in the office, the doctor says you need to lose weight. You say, okay, that sounds reasonable. Doctor says you need to eat less refined carbohydrates and exercise more. You say, that makes sense to me. You come back in a month later, you haven't done it. The doctor says, what happened? You say, I wasn't able to make it happen. And the doctor writes in the chart, non-compliant, right? That's the term that the doctor will use to describe a person who has a willpower failure. You knew what you were supposed to do, but you didn't do it. And, this is a blame game. It doesn't work. So if you look at the fact that over half of Americans have one of these chronic diseases, and that 40% of Americans have two or more of these diseases, then you could argue that these things we're doing in the clinic and telling people what they need to do differently just aren't working. So the options are we can kind of say, what else could we do? Or we continue on in our merry way, which is saying, okay, we did our part as doctors. But the much bigger picture here has less to do with medicine and more to do with the way we make decisions in our day to day. Because we all have these little things we want to do better in our lives, whether that's wake up at 6 a.m. so that we go jogging because that was on our New Year's resolution list, or call up our grandmother on her birthday, right? It's all these little things. Maybe you just want to eat one healthy meal a day. So these are these key points where we need to make better decisions. And when we don't, which we often don't, why so many New Year's resolutions fail, we start blaming ourselves and then we develop stress and then we wind up making worse decisions maybe than if we hadn't tried to fix anything in the first place. And so what we talk about in the book is, the fact that we continue to make poor choices despite wanting to behave differently tells us that we're missing a part of the puzzle. And if you ask where do decisions come from, it's quite clear that they come from the way our brains are wired. So, for example, when you don't get enough sleep, when you skip a night of sleep, you're going to be aware that your thinking is slowed, right? It's why they tell you don't sleep or don't drive if you haven't gotten enough sleep. Your attention is off. But it also turns out that your emotional reactivity is off. People who were deprived of sleep for one night showed a 60% greater increase or a 60% increase in activation in an emotional hub of the brain when they were seeing pictures of stuff that was designed to incite emotion. So what does that mean? It means that when you don't get enough sleep, you're more likely to be emotionally reactive. So as it relates to your decision making, if you skip sleep so that you could stay up late to watch Netflix, which we've all been there, there's some great shows, and then you show up at work the next day and your boss says something to you that was maybe a little bit snarky, you're going to be more likely to lash back out at them, to say something that was stupid, that might actually damage your job. And the reason for that is because your choice to not get enough sleep changed the wiring of your brain to make it less likely that you could make a good decision. So there are all these ways that we can now understand the neuroscience that will enable us to hack into making good choices that take us away from this whole blame thing, because now we say, wait a second, the way I make choices is a reflection of my brain wiring. So I'm not going to blame myself if I eat the donut today. That was the inevitable consequence of things like not getting enough sleep, which is associated with a 385 calorie a day increase in food consumption. So basically what I'm trying to say is we can do so much better than blaming ourselves for a lack of willpower or information. We can instead get to the machinery that determines our decision making and start making tweaks there that are going to compound and improve our lives so much more than just trying to force ourselves into making better choices.
Yes, I love it because on one level, so okay, exactly to your point, like we've got all these people who have all these chronic diseases, but then way further than that, you have just your average person who wants to make whatever changes they want to make in their life. And we say, all right, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And then we don't. And then we beat ourselves up over it. We think it all comes down to our own like willpower and our strength. And then we get into these negative cycles when in reality, it's kind of like if we understand the actual just neuroscience and biology of these machines that we're walking around in, like these bodies that we live in, then we understand better, okay, what is going to help me make better decisions and what is going to prevent me. Because if you're not hacking the true science of the bodies that we live in, like you're not going to be able to do it just on willpower alone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And the thing is about this, we implicitly understand that this is what's going on. When it comes to sleep, for example, if you have a child and you don't let them get a nap and they get cranky, you say, oh, it's because they didn't get a nap. We understand that that affects their behavior. But when it relates to us, we think we can just suppress poor behavior and act in a more reasonable way. We think that we're always in control of our decisions if we just cared a little bit more than we do what we needed to do. And, it's just such like a present-centered mentality, which is in any given moment, you have the ability to do whatever is necessary versus the reality of it, which is we need to be making decisions today for how we're going to act in a week from now, a month from now, and a year from now. And when you start doing that, again, I mentioned the word compounding, you want that compounding interest because now you're going to start building a brain that consistently makes better choices. as it relates to your day-to-day decisions, you've got to understand that these are probability functions, meaning at any given moment, the chances that you make a good or bad decision aren't 50-50, right? There's some sort of a probability that is determined by whatever else is going on in your life. If your boss just yelled at you or your romantic partner just yelled at you are going to be more likely when you're looking at, let's say, a tasty muffin to eat that muffin, right? We understand that there are things going on in the brain and in the body that are going to affect the chances we choose the right thing. But so what I tell people about that then is by the time you get to the point of making a decision, let's go back to that muffin. That's a tasty muffin that's sitting there on the counter. By the time you get there, the major factors that go into what you choose are largely already determined, because your choosing to eat that muffin might be determined by whether you got enough sleep last night, whether you were engaging in meditation or another stress reduction technique, whether you were exercising and developing a brain that was enabling you to think better, whether you'd establish these routines over time. And so the last thing you want to do is kick the can down the road so that when you get to the decision, you have to force yourself to choose better. It's this idea of ego depletion or willpower depletion that you do kind of lose stamina over time when you're constantly trying to make these tough choices versus developing a brain that makes the easy choice the better choice.
Yeah, because I heard this concept, which was fascinating to me, of like decision fatigue, that we
Right.
can really only make so many difficult decisions in a day. If you think about your brain as a muscle, your muscles are only so strong. If you equate it to, like doing some kind of, I don't know, like bicep curls or something, like eventually your muscle's going to give out. And that's why people like Steve Jobs like wore the same thing every day and ate the same thing every day, because it's just the more of those little decisions you can just completely remove from your life, then you save kind of that energy for bigger decisions.
Exactly. Well, so, I mentioned this in this whole ego depletion or willpower depletion. That's the idea, is that you only have a reserve so much of the ability to focus and make good choices. Now, actually, some of this comes from this marshmallow experiment where it showed people were able to kind of hold back. Children who were able to hold back and not act immediately by eating a marshmallow had predicted better outcomes later on. And then it kind of moved into some of these experiments where they show that when people had to stay focused on a tough task, whatever that might be, they were more likely to then make impulsive choices right afterwards. They couldn't wait as long. And, a lot of talk right now about maybe that isn't quite as accurate as we thought it would be, that they've tried to replicate at least some of the ego depletion studies, and they're not necessarily consistent. But the bottom line, I would say, is this: when you are constantly forcing yourself to try to make good choices, that just doesn't work. Whether it's because you deplete some sort of reserve or because your brain gets distracted or whatever else might be going on. What does seem to work, though, is creating a system that enables you to make better choices over time. And one of the best ways of doing that is by designing a brain that lets you make good choices. The other major factor in that, I believe, is using habit formation loops so that you tether the behaviors that you want with rewards such that you will continue to do them automatically, and you're not always thinking through, how can I force myself to do this next task?
Okay. I love that. I want to dive into that. I want to talk about kind of the brain and have you give us a little brain 101 lesson. But first, I just want to touch on, because man, just in the very beginning of the book, you guys started with this scenario of kind of how different our mornings are. And, we wake up and how many minutes is it till we reach for our phone? And, are you calm driving to work? Are you distracted and checking text messages and emails and just all of these changes that in the scheme of things are very recent changes in how we live our lives. Or you go into like what disconnection syndrome is. So can you explain to us what is disconnection syndrome?
Sure. What we talk about in the book is that as it relates to decision making, there are two kind of ways in which we can make decisions. One is a more emotional, impulsive way, which is governed more by limbic centers in the brain. We talk about this part of the brain called the amygdala that is usually thought of as a emotional hub, or also involved with fear and anxiety. And when we're acting from that part of the brain with our decision making, again, we tend to be a little bit more impulsive, more aggressive, more anxious in our thinking. And the other part of the brain that we talk about is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is located in the front of the brain. It's right behind the forehead, as opposed to the amygdala, which is kind of, if you were to draw a line between your eye and your ear, it's right in the middle of your brain. But the prefrontal cortex gives us the ability to restrain ourselves, to think about the future, and not to act so impulsively. And so, what you want is actually to have a balance between these two parts of the brain. You want to have the emotional information coming up from the limbic system because it helps you to get that gut feeling a bit, but also just to inform your decisions. And that's a good thing. But you also want to have the top down, meaning from the prefrontal cortex down to the amygdala, type of processing too, where you are able to calm down and not chase after somebody because they cut you off in traffic. And so what we discuss is that we have this disconnection syndrome, which is a physical manifestation of a breakdown in the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. You want those two parts of the brain to talk to each other. When they don't, when the amygdala or the limbic system is able to make choices and behave without being supervised by the parent, which is the prefrontal cortex, you wind up making worse choices. And so we talk about disconnection syndrome as a result of a couple of major factors of the modern world. One of the things that research has shown leads to a breakdown in communication between those two parts of the brain is sleep deficit. You can see that after a night or two of sleep deficit, there's less connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and people also tend to make worse choices concurrent with that. We also talk about the role of inflammation, because recent research shows that when we have higher levels of inflammation, we are actually more likely to make impulsive, poorly thought out decisions. And then the final piece of this is chronic stress. Now, I'm sure that you've talked about chronic stress before. It's something that we all experience. Why it's relevant is that when you look at studies, and these are studies primarily done on animals, as to what happens when people, or in this case, animals, are exposed to chronic stress, you actually see the neurons, the cells in the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, shrivel up versus the neurons in the amygdala, which tend to get bigger and more connected. So it literally changes the relative balance of those two parts of the brain, in addition to breaking the connection between those two parts of the brain. And why is that so important? Why do we care about these kind of technical, sciencey things? It's because we believe this is associated with these major issues we're seeing in the modern day, which is that we are disconnected from ourselves, from our mental health, from our physical health, from each other, from the relationships and the people around us, and also to the planet as a whole. And so we feel that by making interventions, by choosing to intervene, by improving that connection between those two parts of the brain, and by shifting the balance more towards equilibrium, that will then translate into better mental health, better physical health, better relationships, and a deeper connection with the planet.
Okay, I want to get into those three things. But first, I do want you to touch on, because you guys talk about how just kind of with modern life, we've almost like that disconnection has been taken advantage of, or we've almost been manipulated into even more bad decision making. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened there?
Yeah, well, this is the key point in the first half of the book, is to understand how modern life has manipulated our thinking and changed our brains. There are a lot of factors that are involved with that, but let's go through some of the more straightforward ones. You probably watch some news. I watch some news. And at the moment, it turns out people are watching more news than ever because of coronavirus. But, the thing about watching the news or paying attention to the media is that we've got to understand, what is the intent that these people have with this stuff they're putting out? What is that stuff doing to us? And is it of benefit? If you are a news company, and maybe if you're a social media company as well, your goal is to take the attention of the people who are potentially tuning in, and to some extent to capitalize on our financial state as well, getting us to buy things. So your goal is to get eyeballs to stick to the page as long as possible. Now, if that is what the intent is, then you would, if you were smart, leverage what we know about human psychology, which is that humans have a negativity bias. We tend to pay more attention to things that are negative. So if you're now putting out a news show, your options are you can say something balanced, like there were some bad things that happened in the world today. There were also some good things that happened in the world today. Or you can do what we actually see, which is make every bit of news breaking news, highlight all the horrible things that are happening at a local, at a national, and an international scale, and in essence, hijack the part of our brain, the amygdala, that is specialized to tune in to stress and to induce anxiety in our bodies. As I said before, it's a problem because when we are experiencing this chronic stress for days, weeks, months, it is going to change the wiring of our brain such that we make worse choices, such that we also experience worse mental health and physical health. So, again, if you are a media company, you tend to put out material that is hijacking us by putting out this sensationalized and negative content, which it brings us to the other two things I was describing. What does it do in your brain? It is going to lock you into a worse way of thinking, a more anxiety prone way of thinking. And also, we've got to ask about then what is the trade off? So if you want to go on social media, if you want to watch TV, that's fine. But is there a way of doing that such that you can benefit from it and not experience all these detrimental consequences? And we believe there is. I'll just go into this one last piece before we go to the next topic, because I think it's one of the more practical tools that we describe in the book. And that is, if you're going to be engaging with digital technology, understand that much of it is designed to hijack your time, your attention, your money. What you want to do is have a strategy. We designed this strategy called the test of time. It's an acronym, and it stands for T, time restricted. So you want to limit the total amount of time you're engaging with these devices, with these media outlets. I is for intentional, meaning that when you go onto the TV or the computer or your smartphone, you have a purpose to that. So if you're going on Facebook to see what your second cousin twice removed's daughter looks like on her third birthday, that's fine. But make that the plan so you're not then, I don't know, scrolling through and finding out about this one person you met one time who has inherited a monkey and whatever else, right? We've all gotten stuck in those traps. So have a plan and stick to that plan. M is for mindful, and that's an easy one to work on because we tend to be very mindless when we're engaging with these technologies. I can't tell you how many times when I was younger, I would watch a couple of episodes of a TV show or go on YouTube and then find myself an hour later asking what just happened. I don't really remember much of that experience. Why this matters is if you're mindful, you're going to be more aware of how you're spending that time when you're on this digital media. And also, if it starts to compromise your mental health. As I said before with the news, it tends to be aggressive and anxiety provoking. If you're mindful, you might be aware of that and say, you know what? It's important for me to know what's going on in my neighborhood, but I don't need to hear about that third shooting. And so I'm experiencing anxiety. I'm now going to turn off the TV. And then E is the final part of the TIME acronym, and that stands for enriching. And what we mean by that is it's very easy to go into these digital holes and to come out the other end with having your attention or your money or your time been wasted. And if you are ensuring that it's enriching, that means that once you're done engaging with digital media, you pause and you say, was this something that actually benefited me, or was it primarily something that benefited the company that produced this media? If the answer is that it helped you, then fine. If the answer is, which is often the case, that you didn't really gain much from it, then you go back and you reset your time, you reset your intention, and you reset your mindfulness filters so that next time you do it, it's more benefit to you.
Okay, I love that because it's very practical and just kind of easy to follow. But I imagine it's also very difficult because I feel like we've all been living in this kind of addiction to the news and social media that now we've got this, I don't know, you want to call it like FOMO or just this, because people will say, well, like it's important to know what's going on. Like I need to know, like we've been brainwashed to think that we absolutely have to stay up to date on everything, like especially given, say, the current situation.
Well, this speaks to another kind of hijacking that's going on, and that is humans have a natural tendency to care about social relationships. They care about them a lot. We all care about them a lot. And this probably derives from the fact that when we were running around outside and doing the hunter-gatherer type thing, the tribe was essential. That's what was going to keep you alive. You needed that to defend you against a threat. You needed that to keep you safe in general. And you needed that to have food to eat so that you could all rely on each other. So for one reason or another, humans care a lot about what other people think, and they care a lot about staying engaged with community, which in many ways is a wonderful thing. It helps bring people together. But then you've created these platforms. I don't mean you, Casey, I mean
Yeah.
people.
I
But
wish I had. I'd
yeah, we'd be having a different conversation.
yeah.
But let's say, you are a social media company, whichever one that might be. You created this thing perhaps initially to benefit people so they could connect, but at this stage we've got to ask, what is the connection we're getting out of this? A lot of the time when we're engaging with social media, we tend to find ourselves falling into these silos of people with similar opinions, where we're kind of railing against the other political party, or people who believe that Billy Joel is the best singer versus Springsteen, or whatever it might be. We wind up not really having the benefit that comes from social interaction, which is being able to learn from other people's experiences, being able to look at other viewpoints, and instead just find ourselves again getting stuck in this trap of aggression and negativity and anxiety based on all this stuff that's putting out there that's actually pushing us apart. So social interactions are great, but it doesn't mean that they're all great. When you're going on social media, there's a decent chance that those social interactions are actually going to be causing you harm, mental, psychic harm. So it's another factor that we need to keep in mind when we're dealing with the modern world. I think back to your original point, it is difficult to pull ourselves away from digital technology. And there have been a couple of people, Cal Newport, for example,
Mhm.
who have been advocating for us to really pull back to a significant degree. And what he talks about in his book, Digital Minimalism, is that we should make a concerted effort to pull back from all of these addictive forms of media to reassert our dominance in our day-to-day life. I think that for the average person, it's certainly worth a try, and it's certainly worth trying some of those types of steps. In our book, we talk about some pretty practical and not as intense interventions that people can make to lower the level that they are distracted by social media. But one of the things that I find to be maybe a deeper point on all of this is, if we're able to take a step back from our lives for just a moment and ask whether, despite the fact that we feel the FOMO, we feel like we should be watching more of those TV shows because everybody else is, or we feel like we should be eating those foods because everyone else seems to be enjoying them, we've got to ask ourselves, how are people doing as a whole, right? And if we can develop insight into this, then I believe it is going to steel us and allow us to make better choices. So what I mean by that is, we've all been in situations where we're around friends, family, otherwise, where they're telling us we should eat a certain food that we know isn't good for us. And maybe we're at a point in our lives where we're trying not to eat that food, right? Maybe you're at somebody's birthday and you've been trying not to eat refined carbohydrates because maybe you know that that's good for you and you just want to improve your health. But then it's your friend's birthday and they roll out this homemade carrot cake or whatever it might be. You have a moment there where you're going to have to make a choice as to whether you want to continue to engage in that or if you want to pull back a little bit. And it's difficult. It's just like social media when everybody else is online. Hey, I want to participate and not be rude and all the other stuff. But what I do in these cases is I sometimes think about the fact that most people are not doing well in their lives, that the majority of Americans, 70+%, are overweight or obese, that 30% or so of people are going to suffer from a diagnosable anxiety disorder, 20+% with depression. That, as I said before, more than half of Americans are going to develop a chronic disease. And a lot of those are preventable. And I say, if I continue to do what everybody else is doing, I should expect to have the same outcome as everybody else. And that outcome is not good. It's not good mental health. It's not good physical health. So it's because you're capable of making those difficult decisions that you should expect to have better outcomes in your life. And I think that reframing it a little bit from that perspective can be helpful in those specific instances where it can seem rude. And I'm not saying you have to be rude. You could tell your friend, hey, listen, I just don't feel well when I eat carrot cake because I'm trying to do other stuff right now, whatever it might be. Those people should be willing to listen to you. And if they're not, maybe that's another issue. But if you want to increase your chances at having an amazing life, then you have to be willing to do things differently from most people. And if it was easy, everybody would be doing it.
Well, see, that's so interesting because, okay, so like in that moment, like you're at a friend's birthday party, cake comes out, looks delicious, but you've been doing the work to live in your prefrontal cortex and you're like, I'm not going to have any. It's so interesting to me then the reactions from other people. It's like we all want to be miserable together. And so people will literally give you a hard time, like, oh, come on, it's just a piece of cake. Don't be like ridiculous. So does that tie back to like our sense of community where it's like,
Absolutely.
if we're going down, we all want to go down together?
But so it absolutely does. But let's go back a little bit in the years of peer pressure to what is perhaps a far more significant version of that, and that would be drinking in college. We have, I shouldn't say we. I should say just as people, there is a tremendous amount of binge drinking that occurs in college and in general, right? It's a big deal. And a lot of that, especially in college, is due to this wanting to fit in, this peer pressure thing. And that is a very powerful force because we so desperately want to be part of the crowd and to feel safe. And that's what comes with it. You don't want to let other people down either. And so maybe in the case of the birthday cake, you want to be nice to this friend of yours. But I think that part of this has to do with just developing who you are as a person and developing the things that you care about enough that you want to stand up for. I mean, I would say it doesn't mean that you can't eat some carrot cake, right? It doesn't mean you can't have a beer if that's what's going on. But it does mean that what we should aspire to do is to have a little bit more control over the long-term ramifications of our choices. Because there's going to be, or there always will be, these moments where you have to decide if you want to prioritize the short-term gain or the long-term. And there are a whole lot of factors that go into that. But one of the key factors is being able to see the pros and cons of that decision, which is why the prefrontal cortex is so important to developing as we get older. One thing that's also interesting to me is research shows that the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully come online until the early to mid 20s. So now you're thinking about people who are in college or younger who are tasked with these difficult decisions of, driving safely, whether they should drive after they consumed alcohol, things that we say, wow, why would a person ever do that? Look, the decision-making machinery hasn't matured all the way. So, we should expect to some extent that decisions made in those early years are not going to reflect the most measured overall outcomes. And to that end, I think it makes a lot of sense to support people with interventions that help strengthen that decision-making ability, as opposed to what we do right now, which is still just blame these people for poor choices.
Okay, so I just connected some dots in my head. So I'm going to try and articulate this, and you tell me if I'm right or if I'm off track. So, all right. So our amygdala, I think, is often also referred to as like the monkey brain, which is kind of our old like survival instincts, which makes sense of why it would maybe have a negativity bias because back, a million years ago, a rustle in the woods could be a dinosaur. And so we were constantly like in danger of dying. And that then feeds into the importance of the community and the tribe because we had a much higher chance of staying alive if we were in the tribe. And the days are very different now. So like in those moments of peer pressure, if you've been fostering a better connection and balance then you've got the prefrontal cortex to be able to like calm your amygdala down to be like, okay, calm down. Just because you don't have this piece of cake doesn't mean you're getting kicked out of the tribe. And if you do get kicked out of the tribe, it doesn't mean you're going to get eaten by a dinosaur. Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, I'm kind of moving away from connecting these parts of the brains with different animals because it's like an easy thing to do, and we actually do it in the book. But it's a lot more complicated than that. I do think that a good way of understanding that is that your brain is set up for you to survive. This is what you were just describing, and so you have this area that we've called sometimes the limbic brain, the monkey mind, and all that, or the monkey brain. But really, just you have this area of the brain that is tasked with making quick decisions to keep you alive. And to that end, it does a phenomenal job when there are imminent dangers, right? So I don't know about dinosaurs, but let's say it's a saber-toothed cat. There's some sort of a threat in the bushes. that's the one that's going to say, I need to either get ready to fight or I need to get out of here immediately. It's great. We want to allow that part of the brain to make the decision, and then we manage to hopefully survive. Like it's a wonderful mechanism that is there to preserve our existence. The issue is that the modern world has very little to do with the way that humans spent most of their time on Earth, right? The pressures are very different. The stressors that we experience now, for the most part, not universal, but for the most part, especially in America, have less to do with being able to outrun some sort of an animal or ensure that you have food on the plate that night. Again, that's not universal, but for a lot of people, those are things that are kind of taken care of. They're relatively safe, and they've got kind of the lower levels of Maslow's pyramid are taken care of. So then it's a question of saying, what are the problems that you are going to experience? And those are things like relationship stress, like stress at work. And as we experience those things, they still filter through that same system that used to be activated when there was a threat to our day-to-day survival. Now it's taken over for the threats to our existential kind of like, who am I person who was somebody said something mean about me to work and how dare they, and now I'm going to ruminate over it. Those are the same parts of the brain that get activated in anxiety and depressive disorders. So the point being, not that we need to get into the technicalities of what happens in these disorders, but on a day-to-day basis, what we would like to do is have the higher level parts of the brain, and I call them higher in that they seem to be more recently developed, and that's the prefrontal cortex, be the adult in the room, so that when the limbic system, the amygdala, says, I'm positive there's a monster under my bed, we need to panic, it's willing to say, no, calm down, it's okay. Even though your boss yelled at you at work, we're going to do a great job tomorrow, and there's nothing we can do. It's kind of that whole thing about serenity prayer, right? Mm-hmm. Getting the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change. And the prefrontal cortex is pretty good at calming us down from dangers that don't necessarily require that are more psychological dangers. It's a question of then, how do we set up that activation pattern? And the way that we do that is we need to reinforce prefrontal control. We can do that through things like meditation, through exercise, through the right kinds of diet. But it's, with the exception perhaps of sleep, these are things that are going to take a little bit in order to lead to the types of changes we want to see. You can see, for example, in people who have meditated for long periods of time, there are structural changes in the brain that you can see more gray matter or more kind of mass in the prefrontal cortex versus people who haven't done much meditation. So we do know that these are things that are linked to structural changes in the brain. But for people listening, if you want to do something that's even more quick as far as seeing those results, we know that after even a few weeks of meditation, you see changes in the activation patterns in the brain. And those are the same types of activation patterns that we want to see. Specifically, it's connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Okay, so I love the analogy of the parent and the child in terms of prefrontal cortex and amygdala. I think that's a great way to think about it. And I've done an episode on meditation. I'm a big believer in it, believe in all the science, but I'm curious, like, do we know why it affects the brain? Like, how is that happening?
It's a good question. I'm definitely not going to tell you we have all the answers to literally anything. And in meditation, I think it's one of these situations where we kind of know this thing's work because it's worked for thousands of years, and now we have the science to back it up. But what actually happens in the body when we meditate? I mean, I guess let's go through some of the stuff we do know. One of those things is that we calm down the sympathetic nervous system and activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And that doesn't require any sort of really intense meditation. Even just doing a mindfulness exercise, like some deep breathing for 12 minutes or so, is associated with these types of changes. Now, why does that matter? These are two parts of the nervous system. They're actually branches of what is called the autonomic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight part of it. What it does is it gets the body ready to go, either to fight a predator or to run away. So it increases the glucose in our blood so that we have energy supply. It increases the blood flow to our vital organs so that we have enough blood to get oxygen to them when we need to run away. Now, that's, again, as I described before, these are good things if you have a threat. But on the other hand, The parasympathetic nervous system, that's the rest and digest classically, that's the nervous system that takes over when you're more at peace, when you're mellowed out, when you're having a bite to eat with friends, when you're getting in bed at night, ideally. And what we want again is a balance between those two things. But in the modern world, we tend to be stressed all the time. Our sympathetic nervous system tends to be activated all the time. This is associated with the development of mental health issues as well as things like heart disease. So, what meditation or even just mindfulness does is by allowing you to regain some calm, activates that parasympathetic nervous system and decreases some of the effects of that stress response on the body. So that's one way in which it translates into benefits for your brain, into your body. The other big piece of it is that it seems that meditation calms down the limbic system, calms down that emotional part of the brain. Now, how does it actually do that? I think we're still kind of learning it, the specific reasons, but there are enough data points that we can say there are ways we could describe it happening. As I said before, when you have stress, that activates the amygdala and it kind of breaks down the prefrontal cortex. So, if you are lowering stress by increasing parasympathetic nervous system and decreasing sympathetic, that is going to translate into less activation of the amygdala. And then over time, is going to translate into better connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is going to then lead you to some of those positive outcomes as far as being less emotionally reactive. And again, this isn't 100% concrete, but from what we have available, there's definitely some mechanistic ideas as to what might be happening when you just close your eyes and pay attention to your breath for a few minutes.
What about spending time in nature? Because the book talks about that. It's one of the things you guys recommend in the 10-day brainwash that you have towards the end of the book, which I love. And, I've always, it's one of those things I think that we kind of feel on some level when we're out in nature, that we feel better, yet we aren't always really like aware of the impact that might be having and the importance. So talk a little bit about why it is important for our brains that we spend time in nature.
Yeah, and to that point, you mentioned that people feel better when they're in nature. A lot of the stuff we talk about in the book is stuff that we deeply understand already. I don't think there are many people who go out into the woods and come back home and say, wow, that was miserable. Those mountains were awful. I hate that waterfall. That river was the worst. It's a good thing. You go outside in the middle of the day, you get some sunshine, you're going to come back in for the most part. Again, I don't know what else happens while you're outside, but for the most part, you're going to feel a little bit better. But just like with meditation, we now have the science to show us what's going on. And I think that, there are a couple of things I would mention for the science. One is it lowers levels of stress. One is it improves immune function. One is it's associated with better mental health outcomes. So there are all sorts of specifics that you can get into as far as what you're going to get from going out into nature, or even in some cases, looking at a picture of nature or having some plants in your home. But I think there's this, similar to perhaps people who don't look at sleep as too important, there's a group of people who look at nature as unnecessary. They want to be in the office, they want to be grinding out. And it turns out that going out into nature is associated with the ability to focus better on tasks. It's also associated with increased creativity. It's also associated with an increased ability to recognize the emotional states of other people. So if you're somebody saying that I don't get nature, it doesn't matter that much, you should know that you're probably missing out on some of these very tangible benefits in your day-to-day life by writing it off. If you're somebody who experiences stress, that's kind of the easiest one, then getting outside for a while has been shown to, in one study that was done in Michigan, 20 minutes a week of urban nature exposure has been shown to lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol in people's saliva. So it really doesn't seem to take all that much. And what's great is, as we look at this research, there are benefits that people can be getting by just bringing some plants into their homes or even looking at photographs of nature. So if you happen to be somebody who is stuck at home a lot, right now we're dealing with the COVID thing, so a lot of us are stuck at home a lot. You should know that even something like watching a video of nature on YouTube might be something that could provide you with psychological benefit.
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't want to run out of time to talk about empathy, but I do want to let everyone know that the book gets into nature, it gets into food, sleep, exercise, quiet time or meditation, and kind of what that all does for our brain and our prefrontal cortex. But I definitely want to touch on empathy. So how do you define empathy, and then why is it so important?
Sure. Empathy, I think, is best divided into a couple of subtypes of empathy. We tend to use the term for a lot of different things, but there are actually a few different ways of describing empathy that are worth going into. The first one would be effective empathy. Effective empathy is perhaps best characterized as feeling what somebody else feels. If you stub your toe and I saw you stub your toe and I wince, that's my effective empathy. I'm experiencing the sensation, the ooh, right? Then there's cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And it kind of requires you to have an understanding of what their life might be like at that moment and to have some data to support it. So, for example, you say that you believe in one political party being the best political party. I say, I disagree completely. And you say, well, actually, here's the reasons why I believe this. Cognitive empathy would let me think, oh, now I can kind of see where you're coming from. Doesn't mean I agree with you, but I can start to appreciate how you developed your perspective. And then the last part of this, which is sometimes determined as a type of empathy, is compassionate empathy or just compassion in general. And really, what that is, to me at least, it's being able to put empathy into practice. So it's one thing to really feel what somebody else feels and just sit there and feel crummy when they're feeling crummy. It's another thing to say, wow, I can totally see that you're having a terrible day and feeling awful. Let me get you a cup of tea. That's a compassionate gesture. And so that's really, again, putting the empathy into action. And what we talk about in the book is that, I mean, obviously empathy is an important thing. I don't think it, most people would benefit from more empathy, is, I guess, the bottom line. But we've seen, at least in certain research from a Dr. Sarah Conrath, that empathy scores are decreasing in college students. And what we talk about as it relates to social media and a lot of the interactions that we see today is that when you polarize into one camp or another and you go into tribalism, and whether that's the example I said before with political party or whatever it is that you believe strongly in and believe other people are wrong about, there's really not a lot of empathy there. And it is that empathy that enables us to grow and to form strong bonds. And also, it's associated with a number of different health outcomes, positive health outcomes. So, where this comes back to the idea of the brain is that while effective empathy does seem to involve the amygdala to a large part, the cognitive empathy, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, as it is a very cognitive task, requires you to have a prefrontal cortex go online. So in people who have had damage to the prefrontal cortex, they lose their empathy. So what we're talking about here is that the strategies that we're using to strengthen the prefrontal cortex are also the strategies that are going to strengthen empathy. And to tie this back into what we were discussing for nature, it turns out that people who engage with more nature exposure have higher levels of empathy, both for other people and for nature. And you see this when they engage with nature, meaning if you take people and put them out in the woods, those people will then express more empathy, show more empathy towards other people. So it's all kind of ties together. What we're describing is when you shift the balance such that you're activating the prefrontal cortex a little more, behaving a little less impulsively, behaving a little bit more with compassion, these are then going to be actions that both benefit you and other people. And as I said at the beginning, are going to benefit the planet.
Ah, I love it. Okay. I want to close out with one question. I don't know how difficult this question will be. What, for you personally, what was the most interesting or impactful thing that you learned while writing this book?
Well, yeah, that it is a difficult question because I feel that I'm still very much on my journey of learning about what matters and doesn't matter in the world. But I think a couple of things really stood out, and one of those things is what I already described to you, which is that most people in the world are not doing that well, and there are a lot of reasons for this. But one of the big ones is that we have had our brains manipulated such that the decisions we're making are the decisions that we are stuck making. And whether that's eating junk food or having bad relationships or engaging with a whole bunch of stressful media, we've kind of been pushed to believe that we can stop at any moment. And yet, the fact that our brains have been rewired tells me that we can't, that it's becoming more and more of a trap. And so, what was so important for me to understand is that this whole concept of blaming people for not doing well is not really the way of going about it. It's saying that actually no, the deck has been stacked against them. But while it isn't all their fault that things have turned out the way that they have, it is on us, on the individual, to turn things around. And, that's what I hope that, this podcast, the book, provides, is some of those tools which have been shown through the research to change our brains such that we then are able to get off of the circuit of making poor choices and having poor quality of life, to start making better choices, which will then, over time, build into making more good choices and improving our quality of life.
I love it. That was a very empathetic response. All right. Tell everybody where they can find you, follow you, find the book, and all those things.
Sure. I have a couple of social accounts. I have an Instagram account. It is at Austin Perlmutter, which is just my full name. I have a Twitter account, which is at Austin PERLMD. And I have worked on a book webpage with my father. It's brainwashbook.com. And if you are interested in things that are a little bit less of a medical nature and are more just my musings on weird things that people do, I have a Psychology Today account, and it's The Modern Brain is my blog.
Awesome. Definitely going to check that out. And I will link to all of that in the show notes for everybody. Austin, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I love the book. I encourage everyone to go buy it. And just thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Casey.
Okay, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you are not already following the podcast on social media, please do. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Better You Podcast. If you have feedback on the episode or want to suggest topics or guests, absolutely shoot me an email at thebetteryoupodcast@gmail.com. I love hearing from you all. Please, again, leave a rating and review for the podcast. It helps so much and it means the world to me. If you are open-minded and interested in analytical spiritual conversations, then tune in on Thursday for our conversation with Reverend Peter Panagore. If that isn't your jam, totally understand. Hopefully I'll see you next week when we talk about Party in My Plants. All right, that's it. Talk to you guys soon.